It was the 4th of July, 1982. Fireworks were going off all across Salem, Oregon. Families were outside having a good time. It was a normal holiday night for most people in the city, but on a dirt road outside Salem, a Domino's delivery van was sitting there with the engine still running. The door was wide open. 3 pizza boxes were on the seat and hadn't been touched. A dog was still sitting inside. The 18-year-old girl who'd been driving that van was nowhere to be seen. There wasn't a single witness who saw what happened. The delivery address she'd been sent to didn't exist. The name on the order wasn't real. The phone call had come from a motel. Someone had set this up before she even left the pizza store. For the next 25 years, nobody could prove who that person was. This is the story of Sherry Eyerly and the serial killer who was living and working inside Salem, Oregon for 3 full years before he was caught. Salem, Oregon is the state capital. In the early 1980s, it had a population of around 90,000 people. It was a calm city. Most people who lived there didn't feel any reason to be worried. But between 1981 and 1984, young women in Salem were going missing and being killed. At the time, people living there didn't have a full picture of what was happening or who was behind it. Sherry Melissa Eyerly was born on December 6, 1963. In the summer of 1982, she was 18 years old. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 100 pounds. She had brown hair and blue eyes. She'd recently finished high school and moved into an apartment in Salem with her cousin Cindy. She was working part-time at a Domino's Pizza on Lancaster Drive to cover her living costs. It was a normal part-time job for a young woman who was just starting her adult life. William Scott Smith was born on April 29, 1959, in Portland, Oregon. By the summer of 1982, he was 22 years old. He wasn't working a regular job at that time and was picking up occasional shifts as a cook. He didn't stand out in any obvious way, but between February 1981 and April 1984, Smith kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 4 women in and around Salem, Oregon. He'd later receive 4 consecutive life sentences for those crimes. He became known as the Salem Sniper. This is the story of how one man was able to operate inside a city for 3 years without being stopped. It's the story of a young woman who was taken on a holiday night and whose body was never found. And it's the story of how the truth about what happened to her took 25 years to reach a courtroom. To understand the full picture of what happened in Salem, we have to go back to February 12, 1981. That's the date when the first confirmed killing took place. Terry Cox Monroe was 21 years old. She worked as a store clerk at a Payless location in downtown Salem. On the evening of February 12, 1981, she went out with friends to the Oregon Museum Tavern. At some point that night, she left the tavern on her own. She didn't make it home. Her body was found the next day on February 13, 1981. The coroner who examined her was Dr. Larry Luman. His finding was clear. Terry Cox Monroe had been strangled to death. A reward fund was put together in her name. People called in with information, but nothing that came in was strong enough to move the investigation toward a suspect. The case went cold. During the investigation, police briefly looked at whether her murder was connected to the I-5 killer Randall Woodfield, who was active in Oregon at that time. That connection was ruled out. Monroe's case was left without a named suspect. What wasn't known at that time was that William Scott Smith was already in Salem. The method used in Monroe's killing matched what Smith would go on to use in every case that followed. He went after women who were by themselves. He used strangulation, and he was careful about not leaving physical evidence behind. Monroe's murder was only officially connected to Smith years after he'd already been convicted for the 1984 killings. A retired Salem police sergeant named Jim Miller, who worked with the Marion County Cold Case Squad, spent over 1,000 hours going through the original case records. He noted that the original investigators had interviewed nearly every person who'd been at the tavern that night. There was more documented information in that file than in almost any other case the squad had reviewed. But despite all of that work, Smith hadn't been identified in 1981. Terry Cox Monroe's murder became the 4th confirmed count against Smith. But in February 1981, Salem had no way of knowing what was coming next. Sherry Eyerly wasn't on the work schedule for July 4th, 1982. She was called in at the last minute to fill in for that shift. That's the reason she was on the road that night. Sometime during the evening, a call came into the Domino's on Lancaster Drive. Someone placed an order for a pizza delivery. The address given was on Riverhaven Drive near Brown Island Road. That's a rural area on the outer edge of Salem. The caller used a name that wasn't real. The callback number on the order was later traced to a motel in the area. When police checked the delivery address, they found that no such address existed. At around 9:30 that night, Sherry took the delivery and drove out toward that location. She had her collie dog with her in the van. At around 10 p.m., a pastor named David Stark came across the Domino's van sitting on a dirt road. The engine was running, and the driver's door was wide open. Shortly after that, George Hutmacher and his 2 sons arrived in the same area. They were out setting off fireworks for the holiday. They knew the Eyerly family and recognized the van. They stopped to check. Sherry wasn't there. When police went through the scene, they found 3 pizza boxes still sitting on the seat of the van. They found Sherry's uniform hat on the ground near the vehicle. Her dog was still inside, and there were signs near the van that a struggle had taken place. Sherry Eyerly wasn't at the scene and wasn't found anywhere nearby. The fake address and the motel phone number were the 2 main leads investigators had. Neither one led anywhere useful. Search teams covered the area in the days that followed. Thousands of dollars in reward money were offered for information. Nothing came back that gave investigators a clear direction. The television program Unsolved Mysteries covered Sherry's disappearance more than once over the following years. Her case became one of the most recognized missing persons cases in Oregon. The Statesman Journal newspaper ran quotes from psychics who were brought in to help. None of them produced anything useful for the investigation. Sherry's family paid for private searches on their own. They kept trying for years. Her body was never found. When you look at the details of that night, it's clear this wasn't something that happened without preparation. Someone called from a motel using a name that wasn't theirs. They gave a delivery address that didn't exist in a rural area where there'd be no people around at night. Every part of this was prepared before Sherry ever got in that van. While Sherry Eyerly's case stayed without an answer, William Scott Smith remained in Salem. On February 19, 1984, Rebecca Ann Darling was at work at a convenience store. She was 21 years old. She was working a graveyard shift that she hadn't originally been assigned to. She'd taken the shift from another employee. Sometime after 3:20 in the morning, William Scott Smith walked into that store and took her. Rebecca Darling's body was found near the Little Pudding River. She'd been strangled and sexually assaulted. The Little Pudding River is the same location that would come up again later when Smith told investigators what he'd done to Sherry Eyerly. On April 7, 1984, another young woman from Salem went missing. Catherine Iona Redmond was 18 years old and was studying at Willamette University. On the night of April 7th, she left a fraternity party. Her Datsun car was found less than an hour later at a rural intersection. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. Investigators concluded that Smith had hit the back of her car on purpose to get her to stop and step outside. When she got out to check the damage, he took her. Catherine Redmond was found raped and strangled. The way the scene looked was very close to what had been found at the Eyerly scene 2 years before. A running vehicle, an open door, a young woman gone. The connection between the Darling and Redmond cases was clear to investigators. Same general area, same method, same pattern of going after young women who were alone and in locations where there weren't other people nearby. On April 25, 1984, a grand jury indicted William Scott Smith on charges of murder in the deaths of Catherine Redmond and Rebecca Darling. At the time of the indictment, it was reported that investigators had been looking at the deaths and disappearances of 8 women and girls in Salem going back to March 1981. Smith was 25 years old when he was charged. In July 1984, Smith was convicted of both murders and was sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary to serve 2 consecutive life sentences. At that point, investigators also reviewed the Eyerly case in connection with Smith. He was questioned. He said he hadn't been involved. He told investigators he'd been driving a truck in Washington State on the night of July 4th, 1982, and wasn't in Salem. Investigators at that time weren't able to show that this claim was false. The Eyerly case remained open. More than 20 years went by. Smith remained in prison. Sherry Eyerly's family still didn't have an answer. Her body hadn't been found. No one had been charged in connection with her disappearance. Around 2005, the Marion County Cold Case Squad began a formal reinvestigation of the Eyerly case. The squad worked by bringing together retired law enforcement investigators and active detectives. The investigator who took on the Eyerly case was Jim Miller, a retired Salem police sergeant who was working with the squad as a special investigator. Over the course of the investigation, Miller put in more than 1,000 hours of work on this case alone. The squad didn't start this investigation with the goal of building a case against Smith. The starting point was to check whether Smith could be removed as a suspect. That's how a proper reinvestigation works. You begin with the most likely person, and you either confirm their involvement or you remove them. During that process, investigators found something they hadn't expected. By going through police records and doing follow-up interviews, the squad found documented evidence that William Scott Smith had been stopped and questioned by police near the Eyerly crime scene on the night of July 4th, 1982. He was in Salem that night, not in Washington State. The alibi he'd given investigators in 1984 wasn't true. With that confirmed, investigators turned their attention to the prison. They spoke with people who'd shared a cell with Smith over the years and asked whether he'd ever said anything about the Eyerly case. 2 inmates came forward separately. Both told investigators that Smith had at different points talked about being involved in something that happened with a pizza girl. He never used Sherry's name in those conversations, but the reference wasn't hard to understand. Those 2 inmates had also recorded what Smith said on cassette tapes, and they gave those recordings to investigators. The behavioral review the squad had completed also pointed towards Smith. The fake delivery address, the call from a motel, the false name on the order, the rural location, the strangulation method, the area near the Little Pudding River. All of these details matched the pattern Smith had shown across his other confirmed cases. In 2006, investigators went back to interview Smith directly. He wasn't willing to talk at first. Investigators then offered him a transfer to a different prison as part of an agreement for his cooperation. Smith accepted. He then gave a confession. In his confession to the Marion County cold case, investigators, Smith described what he'd done on the night of July 4th, 1982. He said he'd called the Domino's pizza location that evening and placed an order using a name that wasn't his. He gave Riverhaven Drive as the delivery address, knowing it wasn't a real location. He made the call from a motel. He chose that rural area because it was away from other people and away from any witnesses. Smith then told investigators something that hadn't been known before. He said that Sherry Eyerly wasn't the person he'd been planning to take that night. He told investigators he'd intended to go after a different woman. Sherry was sent out on that delivery because she'd been called in to cover the shift at the last minute. She wasn't supposed to be the one who showed up. Even knowing she wasn't who he'd planned for, Smith went ahead. He took Sherry Eyerly from that dirt road outside Salem. He strangled her near the Little Pudding River. He then put her body into the river. Sherry Eyerly's body has never been recovered. The river was searched and nothing was found. Her family has never had a burial for her. There's no grave and there's no place for them to go to remember her. During the confession, Smith didn't show any sign of regret for what he'd done. The investigators who were present noted this. It was also reported in press coverage afterward. He gave the information investigators asked for, but showed nothing that suggested what he'd done had any meaning to him. The confession answered the main question that had stayed without an answer for 25 years. But it also brought up something that's never been resolved. Smith said he'd been planning to take someone else that night. He's never publicly named that person. No public document has confirmed who that intended person was. That detail has never been officially answered. On December 18, 2007, William Scott Smith appeared in a courtroom in Salem, Oregon, before Marion County presiding Judge Paul Lipscomb. Smith was 48 years old at that point. He entered a guilty plea to the murder of Sherry Melissa Eyerly. The hearing didn't take long. Law enforcement officials from the Marion County Cold Case Squad were there. Members of Sherry Eyerly's family were also in the courtroom. Under the terms of the agreement with prosecutors, Smith received a third consecutive life sentence. That sentence runs at the same time as the two he was already serving for the murders of Rebecca Darling and Catherine Redmond. Sherry's family didn't speak to reporters after the hearing. Her mother put out a written statement. In it, she thanked the law enforcement officers who'd worked on the case for more than 2.5 decades. The prosecutor spoke after the hearing and described Sherry's disappearance as one of the most well-known missing persons cases in the area. He said her family had spent thousands of dollars over the years trying to find her. Judge Lipscomb addressed the courtroom before the proceedings ended. He spoke on behalf of the people of Salem and said the community was glad to finally have this answer, even after so many years had passed. The cold case squad's reinvestigation had taken 2 years to finish. Hundreds of leads were checked. Hundreds of interviews were carried out. A false alibi that had stood for 25 years was broken through documented police records. Prison recordings on cassette tape were collected and used as part of the case. A behavioral review connected the pattern of the crime to Smith, and a confession was obtained through a prison transfer agreement. The same cold case squad later formally connected Smith to the February 1981 murder of Terry Cox Monroe. That became the 4th murder conviction against him. Smith is currently serving 4 consecutive life sentences and is held at a prison in Washington state whose location hasn't been made public. 4 women have been confirmed as victims of William Scott Smith: Terry Cox Monroe in 1981, Sherry Melissa Eyerly in 1982, Rebecca Ann Darling in 1984, Catherine Iona Redmond in 1984. 4 families, and several questions that still don't have a public answer. Smith is considered a suspect in murders beyond these 4 confirmed cases. That's part of the documented public record. No additional charges have been filed. At the time of Smith's 1984 indictment, it was reported that investigators had been looking at the deaths and disappearances of 8 women and girls in Salem going back to March 1981. Not all of those cases have been publicly resolved or connected to any named person. Sherry Eyerly's body has never been found. The Little Pudding River was searched after Smith gave his confession. Nothing was recovered. Her family has never had a place to bury her or a place to go to remember her. The person Smith said he'd originally planned to take on the night of July 4th, 1982, has never been publicly named. Smith stated in his confession that Sherry wasn't his intended target and that she was taken because she showed up instead of someone else. That's never been confirmed or addressed in any public document. These aren't guesses or theories. These are the parts of this case that remain without a public answer in the official records of Marion County. Sherry Eyerly was 18 years old. She wasn't supposed to work that night. She was called in at the last minute. She drove out to an address that didn't exist, and she was never seen again. It took a false alibi being broken through old police records. It took 2 inmates recording conversations on cassette tapes inside a prison. It took a retired police sergeant spending more than 1,000 hours on a single case. And it took 25 years before the truth was said out loud in a courtroom in December 2007. William Scott Smith is serving 4 life sentences. He showed no regret. Sherry's body has never been found. If this case made you think about how many families are still waiting for answers, then share this video. That's how stories like this one stay visible. If you're new here, subscribe. Every case on this channel is built on real records, real investigations, and real facts. The next case we're covering stayed without an answer for decades, and the truth behind it is something most people have never come across.